The heavy oak doors of the Nero Room didn't just open, they were thrown wide by a force that had no business being in a place of such calculated violence. A 7-year-old girl in a tattered pink dress stumbled toward the center table, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. She didn't stop until she reached the man in the white suit. With a trembling hand, she slammed a sweat-soaked, blood-stained bandana onto his silk tablecloth. The room froze. It was a declaration of war from a child. "They took my mama," she choked out, her voice cracking the silence like a whip. "The men with the snakes, they took her." Every hand in the room moved toward a concealed holster. Every eye locked on the blood seeping into the white linen. But the man she had approached didn't flinch. He was Don Vinnie Moretti, the man who owned the city's shadows, and what he did next would shatter 30 years of underworld protocol. "Don't turn away. You are about to witness the moment a monster remembers what it feels like to be a man. This isn't just a rescue, it's a reckoning." Before the first shot is fired, make sure to follow this story to see how the most dangerous man in Chicago risked his empire for a child he didn't even know. Now, let's go back to that humid night in 1987. The Nero Room was more than a lounge, it was a cathedral of crime. The air was thick with the scent of aged bourbon and the unspoken threats of men who decided the fate of the city with a whisper. In this room, silence wasn't just gold, it was survival. The rules were simple: you didn't look up, you didn't listen in, and you never interrupted the dawn. To cause a scene here wasn't just an insult, it was a death sentence. At the head of the table sat Don Vinnie Moretti. At 53, he was a mountain of a man, his presence so heavy it seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. His white suit was pristine, a sharp contrast to the jagged ink of the tattoo coiling up his neck, a permanent reminder of a past paved in lead. For 3 decades, Vinnie had ruled with a heart of stone. Every Tuesday was a surgical exercise in logistics and power. No emotion, no mercy, no mistakes. He had lived by one fundamental truth since the night his wife Teresa was taken from him: empathy is a leak in the armor. Sentiment is the blade that kills you. But as he looked down at the bloody bandana and the child's desperate eyes, the mountain began to move. The silence in the Nero Room was so absolute it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing down on the gathered lieutenants who had moments ago been carving up the city's docks like a Thanksgiving turkey. Don Vinnie Moretti didn't move. He didn't even blink. His gaze was fixed on the sweat-stained crimson and black bandana that now lay like a desecration across his silk tablecloth. The symbol of the Iron Vipers, a coiled serpent with its fangs bared, seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. "Angel," Vinnie said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't look at the girl yet, he looked at the blood. It was fresh. "You said they beat her?" Angelica's small frame shook with such violence that the chair next to her rattled. She wiped a grime-streaked face with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of dark street dust across her cheek. They hit her first," she whispered, her voice hitching. "Mama told me to hide under the flower stall. I saw them. They had the snakes on their necks, just like yours, but meaner. They didn't just hit her, Mr. Vinnie. They put a bag over her head. They threw her in the back of the big black van and drove away." A sharp intake of breath hissed through the room. Big Frankie Gagliano leaned forward, his massive knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. This was no longer a local dispute over protection money. This was a snatch and grab. In Vinnie's world, a beating was a message, but a disappearance was a sentence. Vinnie finally shifted his gaze from the bandana to the child. For the first time in 30 years, the mountain felt a tremor of something he had spent a lifetime burying. He reached out, his large calloused hand hovering over the bandana before he pinched the fabric and lifted it. He turned it over, revealing a jagged hand-stitched J on the corner. "Javi Morales," Sully muttered from the end of the table, his eyes narrowing. "That punk is getting bold. He's moving on the south side flower shops now." "He didn't take her for the money, Sully," Vinnie said, his eyes turning into chips of flint. He saw the terror in Angel's eyes, but deeper than that, he saw the flickering hope that he, the monster of Chicago, could perform a miracle. He realized with a cold, sinking clarity that Lucia Ramos hadn't been targeted for a debt. She had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, and the Vipers had taken her to a place where witnesses went to stay silent forever. "Frankie," Vinnie commanded, the authority in his voice cutting through the rising tension like a blade. "Clear the room. Tell the boys to get the cars. This isn't a business meeting anymore." He looked back at the bandana, his thumb tracing the serpent's head. They didn't just hurt her, Angel. They challenged the king. And they're about to find out what happens when the king decides to hunt. The shadows in the Nero room seemed to stretch and deepen as Vinnie stared at the bloody bandana, his mind slipping through the cracks of time to a night exactly like this one 30 years ago. It was 1957, and the air in Chicago had been thick with the scent of rain and blooming jasmine. He hadn't been a Don then. He had just been Vinnie, a man who thought he could keep the darkness of his profession from touching the light of his home. Teresa had been laughing, her hair a halo of dark curls as she moved through their small kitchen, humming a tune that had been stuck in her head all day. He could still see the way the light caught the gold band on her finger as she reached for a glass. It was the last moment of peace he would ever truly know. The sound that broke it wasn't a scream, but the screech of tires on wet pavement followed by the shattering of the front window. Vinnie had dived for his peace, but he was a second too late. The world exploded in a hail of lead and broken glass. He remembered the heat of the gunpowder, the acrid smoke filling his lungs, and the terrifying sudden silence that followed the roar of engines speeding away. When he crawled across the floor, his hands didn't find the hardwood, they found something warm and wet. Teresa lay amidst the shards of their life, her floral dress stained a deep, mocking crimson. Her eyes, once full of 1,000 shared secrets, were wide and fixed on a ceiling she could no longer see. In that moment, something inside Vinnie didn't just break, it cauterized. He had cradled her cooling body as the sirens wailed, and in the hollow silence that followed, he made a jagged, silent vow. He realized that love was nothing more than a target painted on a man's chest. To care was to provide the enemy with a map to your soul, to protect someone was to give the world a lever to break you. He swore then, with blood still drying on his palms, that he would never again let another human being become his weakness. He would be a mountain, cold, immovable, and utterly alone. The memory flickered and died as Angel's small, hitching sob pulled him back to 1987. He looked at the girl, the same age the daughter he and Teresa talked about having would have been. For 3 decades, he had lived by that vow, convinced that isolation was the only way to remain invincible. But looking at the bloody viper bandana, the ice he had cultivated around his heart began to crack. He wasn't just going to find Lucia Ramos because the vipers had insulted his territory. He was going to find her because 30 years ago, he hadn't been fast enough to save his own world, and for the first time since the reign of 57, he was willing to risk the armor he had built to ensure the darkness didn't take another mother away. Vinnie looked at the small, shivering girl, his dark eyes softening just enough to let her speak. "How did you find me, Angel?" he asked, his voice a low vibration that seemed to steady the air around her. "The Nero Room isn't a place for children. The police station is 6 blocks closer to the flower shop." Angelica wiped her eyes, her small chest heaving as she recounted the journey that had brought her to his doorstep. "I remembered what Mama said," she whispered, her voice gaining a tiny spark of defiance. "She told me the police are just men in uniforms who ask questions while the bad things are already happening. But she pointed you out once, when we were walking past the park. You were getting into your big car, and the sun hit your watch. She said, 'That's the man who keeps the neighborhood quiet. He doesn't ask questions, he just fixes things.'" She described the 12-block gauntlet she had run through the rotting teeth of the South Side. She had darted through alleys where the streetlights had been shot out, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She told him of the shadows that had tried to reach for her, the junkies and the prowlers who haunted the dark corners, but she hadn't stopped. She had kept her eyes on the distant glow of the downtown skyscrapers, searching for the man with the gold watch. She had bypassed the blue and white squad cars idling on the corner of Fifth, instinctively knowing that a badge wouldn't scare the men with the snakes on their necks. Only a monster could stop another monster. "I ran until my shoes felt like they were full of stones," Angel continued, looking up at Vinnie with an intensity that made the hardened lieutenants shift in their seats. "I didn't want someone to take a report, Mr. Vinnie. I wanted someone to bring her back. You're the only one everyone is afraid of. So I figured if you were on my side, they'd have to be afraid for her too." Vinnie sat back, the leather of his chair creaking. He looked at the gold Rolex on his wrist, the heavy links gleaming under the chandelier. For 30 years, that watch had been a symbol of his wealth and his punctuality in business, a cold tool for a cold man. He had never imagined it would be a lighthouse for a drowning child. The fact that she had chosen him over the law wasn't just a testament to his power, it was a terrifyingly pure act of faith. He realized then that he couldn't just send her away with a handful of cash and a bodyguard. By choosing him, she had pinned her mother's life to his soul, and in the silence of the Nero Room, the mountain of Chicago felt the heavy, unfamiliar weight of being someone's only hope. Vinnie stood up, and the Nero Room seemed to shrink. He didn't just occupy the space, he dominated it, the white fabric of his suit shimmering like a shroud under the dim amber lights. The methodical, business-first aura he had cultivated for decades evaporated, replaced by a cold, predatory focus that made even his most seasoned lieutenants go stiff. He looked at Big Frankie, whose face was a mask of grim readiness, and then at Sully, the man who knew every secret buried in the city's concrete. "Frankie," Vinnie's voice was a low, dangerous velvet. "I want every man we have on the street. I don't care if they're supposed to be guarding the docks or counting the slips at the warehouse. Put them in the cars." He leaned over the table, his shadow falling over the bloody viper bandana. "Sully, call the precinct captains. Tell them to keep their boys in the station for the next 4 hours. If I see a blue and white cruiser interfering with our search, I'll hold the commissioner personally responsible. This city is officially under lockdown until Lucia Ramos is found." "Don," Sully hesitated, his brow furrowed. "Moving like this, it breaks the neutrality we've had with the South Side for 10 years. The other families will think we're starting a war. They won't understand why we're shaking the tree for a florist." Vinnie turned his head slowly, the ink of the serpent on his neck looking as if it were ready to strike. "Then let them think it's a war," he replied, his eyes like 2 black holes. "The Iron Vipers snatched a woman from her own doorstep in my neighborhood. They brought her blood to my table. Neutrality died the moment they laid a hand on an innocent. If the other families have a problem with me cleaning my own house, they can come and tell me to my face." He turned to Big Frankie and pointed a heavy gold-ringed finger toward the door. "Start with the informants. Squeeze every snitch from O'Hare to the Navy Pier. I want the location of every black van registered to a Viper associate in the last 48 hours. If a door doesn't open, kick it down. If a mouth doesn't talk, break the jaw. I want Javi Morales's head, but I want the woman alive first." As his men scrambled to follow the orders that would ignite the Chicago night into a frenzy of sirens and squealing tires, Vinnie looked back at Angel. The little girl stood amidst the chaos of mobilizing soldiers, her eyes wide as she watched the mountain move. Vinnie didn't offer her a smile, he offered her his hand. "Stay with the staff, kid. They'll get you some food." He paused, his voice softening just a fraction. "The city is going to get very loud tonight, Angel. But don't be afraid. The noise is for them, not for you." He turned and walked toward the exit, his white suit a beacon of vengeance disappearing into the darkness of the hallway, leaving no doubt that by morning, Chicago would be a very different place. The black Cadillac Fleetwood glided through the fog-slicked streets of the industrial district like a shark moving through murky depths. Inside, the only light came from the orange ember of Vinnie's cigar and the rhythmic green glow of the dashboard. They had squeezed a low-level runner named Petey the Rat near the rail yards, and the man had turned white as a sheet the moment he saw the coiling snake tattoo on Vinnie's neck. He had pointed them toward Pier 42, an abandoned rust-eaten section of the docks where the new breed of the Iron Vipers thought they could play king. Vinnie stepped out of the car into the biting chill of the Lake Michigan wind, his white suit a ghostly beacon against the coal-black shadows of the shipping containers. Big Frankie and Sully fanned out behind him, silent and lethal, but Vinnie walked down the center of the pier with the measured heavy stride of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. He could hear the muffled laughter of young men inside a corrugated metal warehouse up ahead, the smell of cheap beer and exhaust fumes clashing with the salt air. He stopped 10 yards from the entrance, where 2 sentries stood guard. They were barely 20, dressed in flashy leather jackets with the Iron Viper patch, guns tucked clumsily into their waistbands. When they saw the silhouette of the mountain approaching, their bravado evaporated. One of them reached for his holster, but his hand froze mid-air as the light from a nearby street lamp hit Vinnie's face. The boy's eyes went wide, his jaw dropping in a silent O of realization. He wasn't looking at a rival, he was looking at a legend he'd only heard about in whispered warnings from older cons. "I'm not going to ask twice." Vinnie's voice was a low, terrifying rasp that seemed to come from the very shadows themselves. "Where is the woman?" The boy with the gun began to shake, his fingers fumbling as he pulled his hand away from his weapon as if it were red-hot. "W. Moretti? We didn't. Javi said you were retired. He said you were just a ghost in a restaurant." Vinnie took a step closer, his shadow stretching across the warehouse door like a shroud. The new breed liked to talk about empires and respect, but they had never looked into the eyes of a man who had survived 30 years of war. They had the flash, but they lacked the iron. A ghost doesn't leave footprints, kid, Vinnie whispered, leaning into the boy's personal space until the scent of his expensive tobacco overwhelmed the smell of fear. But I'm about to leave a lot of them all over this pier. Tell Javi the mountain has come to the sea, and I've brought the storm with me. The sentry didn't even try to stop him as Vinnie pushed past, the heavy steel door groaning open to reveal the flickering light and the desperate, muffled sounds of a woman fighting for her life. The hunt was over, the reckoning was about to begin. The steel door groaned on its hinges, a sound like a dying animal that echoed through the cavernous expanse of the warehouse. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of damp concrete and the copper tang of fear. A single work light dangled from the rafters, swaying rhythmically and casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the faces of a dozen men. At the center of the pool of light, Lucia Ramos was zip-tied to a rusted chair, her face bruised but her eyes burning with a defiance that even Javi Morales couldn't beat out of her. Javi stood over her, twirling a switchblade with the practiced arrogance of a man who thought his youth made him untouchable. When the door swung open, he didn't reach for his gun, he smirked, expecting one of his sentries. But the smirk died as Vinnie Moretti stepped into the light. Vinnie was alone. He didn't carry a visible weapon, and he didn't crouch or seek cover. He simply walked, his white suit glowing like a ghost in the gloom, his footsteps measured and heavy. The mountain had arrived, and the sudden drop in temperature was palpable. "That's far enough, old man," Javi shouted, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the terror rising in his gut. Behind him, his crew fumbled for their weapons, their eyes darting toward the shadows behind Vinnie, searching for the army they assumed must be there. "You're out of your jurisdiction, Moretti. This is the new world. We don't play by your geriatric rules anymore." Vinnie didn't stop until he was 5 feet away, the light catching the gold of his watch and the jagged ink on his neck. He looked past Javi, his eyes locking onto Lucia. "Are you hurt, Lucia?" he asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I'm okay," she rasped, her voice thick with pain but steady. Vinnie finally turned his gaze to Javi. It was a look of such profound, icy detachment that the younger man took an involuntary step back. "You think because my name is whispered in restaurants and boardrooms that I've forgotten the weight of a trigger," Vinnie said, the words falling like stones into a well. "You think because I wear a suit, the beast is dead." He took one more step, invading Javi's space until the switchblade was inches from his chest. Vinnie didn't even glance at the knife. "I'm not here as a businessman, Javi. I'm here as the man you should have prayed never to meet. Untie her." One of Javi's enforcers, a man twice Vinnie's size, stepped forward with a growl, but Vinnie moved with a speed that defied his age. In one fluid motion, he caught the man's throat, his thumb pressing into a pressure point that sent the giant crashing to his knees, gasping for air. Vinnie didn't even break his stare with Javi. The room went dead silent. The new breed watched their strongest man collapse without Vinnie even drawing a breath. The legend wasn't just valid, it was terrifying. Javi's hand shook so hard the switchblade clattered to the floor. The mountain hadn't just moved, it had crushed their world without saying a word. Under the flickering light of Pier 42, the Iron Vipers realized that some ghosts still had teeth. The warehouse fell into a silence so profound that the dripping of a leaky pipe sounded like a hammer against the floor. Javi Morales stood paralyzed, his switchblade abandoned on the concrete, staring at the man who had just dismantled his toughest soldier without breaking a sweat. Vinnie Moretti didn't look like a man in the middle of a gang war, he looked like a judge delivering a final verdict. He reached into the inner pocket of his white suit and pulled out a heavy, gold-plated pen and a small piece of paper, the drawing Angel had made of her mother in the flower shop. "You see this, Javi?" Vinnie's voice was barely a whisper, yet it filled every corner of the room. He held the drawing up so the flickering light caught the crayon-colored petals. "This represents a world you're too small to understand. You thought you were big because you could scare a woman and a child. You thought power was a bag over someone's head and a debt of $67. He stepped closer, the gold of his watch gleaming. "But real power is having the city in your pocket and still choosing to listen when a 7-year-old girl asks for help." Vinnie didn't ask for the money back. He didn't demand a cut of the Viper's territory. Instead, he dictated terms that felt more like a religious penance than a business deal. "As of this moment, the Iron Vipers are dissolved," Vinnie declared. "You will sell every asset you have, the vans, the stash houses, the guns. Every cent goes into a trust for the families in this district that you've bled dry. You will personally oversee the rebuilding of Lucia's shop, and then, you will leave Chicago. If I see your face or the face of any boy wearing that snake after sunrise, I won't send Frankie. I'll come myself. Javi looked at his men, but none of them would meet his eyes. The myth of the new breed had shattered against the iron of the old guard. They saw in Vinnie a man who wasn't fighting for a ledger or a drug route, but for something far more dangerous, a soul he had thought was lost 30 years ago. Vinnie walked over to Lucia and personally sliced the zip ties with a small, sharp blade he kept hidden in his cuff. As she collapsed into his arms, sobbing with relief, Vinnie didn't pull away. He held her with the steady protective strength of a father. He had spent his life collecting debts of blood and gold, but tonight, he was paying a debt to a child's courage. The price of his soul was steep, the end of a decade of peace and the start of a war with the South Side, but as he looked at the drawing in his hand, Don Vinnie Moretti decided it was the best bargain he had ever made. 6 months later, the humid tension of the Chicago night had been replaced by a soft, amber autumn glow. The Nero Room was a memory, its heavy oak doors locked and its gold-leafed secrets gathering dust. Don Vinnie Moretti hadn't stepped foot inside it since the night the docks ran red. He had spent 30 years building walls out of stone and shadow, only to realize that the most beautiful thing he owned was a small patch of earth behind a rebuilt flower shop on the south side. Lucia Ramos moved through the rows of chrysanthemums and late-blooming roses with a grace that showed no trace of the zip ties or the warehouse floor. Her shop, Teresa's Garden, was no longer a target for the desperate. It was a sanctuary under a protection that required no ledger and no blood. Every Tuesday, just as the sun began to dip behind the Sears Tower, the street would go quiet as a pristine white Cadillac Fleetwood pulled to the curb. There were no armed guards flanking the doors, no lieutenants whispering about territories. There was only Vinnie. He sat at a small wrought iron table in the garden, his white suit jacket draped over the back of the chair, revealing the coiled snake on his neck that no longer looked like a threat, but a scar of a life moved past. Lucia set a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him, her hand lingering on his shoulder for a brief warm second, a gesture of affection he no longer flinched away from. Nearby, Angelica sat on the grass, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked on a new drawing. She wasn't wearing a tattered pink dress anymore, but her eyes held the same fierce light that had saved her mother's life. She hopped up and ran to the table, sliding a piece of paper over the white linen. It was a portrait of the three of them, standing in front of the shop. Vinnie picked it up, his large scarred fingers trembling slightly as he looked at the crayon-colored world. The city still whispered about the most feared man in Chicago, and there were those in the underworld who waited for the mountain to return to its dark throne. But as Vinnie looked at Angel's smile and felt the warmth of the coffee in his hand, he knew the Nero Room was dead. He had spent his life thinking sentiment was a weakness, a leak in the armor that would eventually lead to a grave. He had been wrong. Sentiment wasn't the blade that killed you, it was the light that showed you the way out of the dark. For the first time in 30 years, Vinnie Moretti wasn't a ghost haunting his own empire. He was a man sitting in a garden, finally, undeniably home.